I hope we will solve them while we move to our second speaker, which is Naim Jina, who is currently the Executive Director of the Afro-Middle East Center, a research institute dedicated to studying the Middle East and North Africa in relations between those regions and the rest of Africa. He earlier taught political studies at the University of Witwatersrand at Johannesburg. Gina rose in the ranks of the Muslim Youth Movement of South Africa to become its National General Secretary and later its president. He steered the movement in a way that increased its political activism during the anti-apartheid struggle. Naim, we are very honored to have you with us. We're very pleased to have us. The floor is yours for 15 minutes. Just before you start, I would like to say to all our participants, after the introductions, we will have a time for some Q&A. Please send them in the chat box. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Ilan, for that more than generous introduction. Let me start by saying that when we think of Israeli apartheid, I think that there's two aspects that we should be looking at. One is, of course, as many of us do, what the comparisons might be of Israeli apartheid with South Africa, but the other, and I think more and more importantly, is what apartheid in Israel means in terms of, or what Israel means in terms of the International Convention against Apartheid, against the crime of apartheid. When I was preparing for this presentation, I looked back at presentations I had made over the past 15 years on this particular topic. And I must say that I kind of laughed at myself at these presentations. I also laughed this morning when I stumbled across this well-known quote by Hendrik Verwoerd. Hendrik Verwoerd is known as the architect of apartheid in South Africa and its prime minister in the 60s. In 1961, he said, "Israel, like South Africa, is an apartheid state." That statement might have been true in 1961 when Verwoerd made the statement. I don't think it's true anymore. And I'll explain why I say that. In the South African context, we might say that apartheid was built on three kind of pillars, and a whole range of legislation that gave effect to those three. The first pillar was formally to demarcate the South African population into so-called racial groups. We had the Population Registration Act, we had the Bantu Building Workers Act, and various other acts that did this. Formally demarcated the population. And so previously, while Black people were oppressed under colonial and somewhat post-colonial era from the early 20th century, these laws gave effect to that kind of demarcation and segregation. The second pillar was to then physically segregate the population into different geographic areas. And we had the Group Areas Act, we had the pass laws and various other such things. This kind of segregation laid the basis for what we refer to in South Africa as grand apartheid. So, you know, apartheid is not really about which park benches you sit on or which toilets you're allowed to use, but the grand apartheid is, in the South African context, that which established the Bantustans, what the government at the time called homelands, established the Bantustans, and in terms of which South Africans were denationalized in the South African context and then transferred, and their citizenship transferred to these fake entities, these Bantustans, whatever their various names might have been. And the third pillar was a kind of matrix of draconian security laws and policies that were employed to suppress any opposition to the regime. Now, if we consider these three pillars of apartheid in South Africa and compare them to what exists in Israel, and let me say, when I say what exists in Israel, I'm talking about from 1948. I mean, when Uri Davis in 1987 published his book, Israel and Apartheid State, he was talking exclusively about the political entity called Israel, not the occupied territory, because firstly, apartheid existed in Israel. And so when Verwoerd said Israel, like South Africa, is an apartheid state, he was referring to Israel pre-67. He was not talking about the West Bank and Gaza. He was talking about Israel and its policy towards the Palestinians, who were supposedly its citizens. So Israel from 1948, from 1949, 1950 we had the law of return, 1952 the citizenship law, etc. These laws sought to do similar kinds of things as in the South African apartheid context, demarcate people in terms of whether they were Jews or not Jews, much simpler than in the South African context, where it was more kind of complex. All of these laws leading up to, of course, the nation state law, most recently. In between, we had, for example, the 2003 citizenship and entry into Israel law. So these laws sought to do similar kinds of things, to demarcate who is a Jew, who is not a Jew, to then provide incrementally a process whereby the segregation of Jews from non-Jews might take place. That process, of course, got a boost in 1967 with the occupation of the West Bank and Gaza, and we see that kind of segregation taken to an absurd level in the West Bank, as Yara pointed out. I mean, in the South African context, that segregation never meant, for example, that we had roads that were only for the use of white people, or that those kinds of things. So it was taken to an absurd level, and the notion of grand apartheid in South Africa, in a sense, has been more perfected in the Israeli context. The third pillar in the South African context, the kind of draconian security measures, etc. Again, and this is why I said, when I looked at my earlier presentations, I kind of laughed, because there really is no comparison between South African apartheid, certainly in this third pillar, but as I said, the other two as well, and Israeli apartheid. I mean, never in the South African context did those security laws and their implementations, for example, mean that that we had helicopter gunships bombing our townships, for example, or even tanks going into our townships. I mean, these were not things that we even expected, let alone experienced. For South Africans, of course, and I'm not going to give you a whole range of quotes from everyone from Mandela to trade union leaders, etc., who have spoken about why they believe that Israel is an apartheid state. And in fact, in many more recent such quotations, that apartheid in Israel is worse than it is in South Africa. And when South Africans speak about apartheid in Israel, they talk generally about apartheid as it is practiced in Israel and in the occupied territories, and regarding it as worse. In 2001, the World Conference Against Racism, tens of thousands of people marched on the streets in Durban, about half of them not South African, but about half of them South African, under the banner Zionism is racism, because I think South Africans understood what that meant. The second, I just want to say a word or two about the second factor around apartheid, because Richard Falk will, of course, speak much more about that. And that is the whole question of the legal understanding and definition of apartheid from the Rome Statute and the earlier International Convention against the crime of apartheid. When we look at the convention in particular, we must note that South Africa is not mentioned in that convention at all. This is from the mid-70s. South Africa is not mentioned. There's one reference to Southern Africa, because because apartheid was practiced not only in South Africa, but also in Zimbabwe, what was then called Rhodesia, as well as in Namibia, what was then called Southwest Africa. So there's one reference to Southern Africa, but the point that is made in the convention is that apartheid is a set of policies and practices as it is done in Southern Africa, but it could exist anywhere in the world. And when we look at Article 2 of that, and I'm sure Richard Falk will speak more about it, we find that all of this, really, or almost all of it, is fulfilled in the Israeli context. Now, let me make one or two more points about the comparison with South Africa, because I don't want to speak about the legal things since Richard Falk is here, before I end. And that is that my point that what we're talking about as apartheid in Israel goes much beyond, in various ways, what we spoke about as, or what we speak about as apartheid as it existed in South Africa. In the South African context, from the beginning, the purpose of apartheid was domination, and through the deprivation of rights and the extraction of labor, domination of black people in order to promote superiority of white people, but the accumulation of wealth. In Palestine, the objective is not the domination from the Israeli perspective, or Jewish Israeli perspective, not the domination of the other, but from the beginning was the establishment of a Jewish state with the erasure of the inconvenient natives. Look at the law of return, look at the nation state law. Palestinians are just a problem from that perspective that really shouldn't exist. In the South African case, black people were to be dominated so their usefulness can be exploited, because they were not only useful, but necessary in order to keep the South African economy going. In the Palestinian or Israeli context, that's not the case. We should also accept that when we talk about Palestine, Palestine does not exist as a state. I think this is an important discussion that we need to have. What is called Palestine, and certainly has been very useful in being able to lodge a complaint at the ICC, the fact that Palestine is recognized as a state. But in reality, this so-called state that we call Palestine, or that is called Palestine, not we call, because I wouldn't, is in fact a Bantustan. The government of this Palestine is a Bantustan authority, whichever party might be running it, even though it has less power than the Bantustan authorities did in the South African context, frankly. Believing that a Bantustan authority can deliver liberation is a foolhardy fantasy. It might be useful tactically, for example, to be able to complain to the ICC or the Human Rights Council, etc. Let me make a quick point. I'm not sure about my time, Ilan, but let me take one more minute to say that while we discuss, we're in a particularly difficult time, as Young Bok said earlier on, for Palestinians, but around the world in general, but for Palestinians, a particularly difficult time, it's tempting to get sucked into the difficulty of the time and not take our discussion beyond that. While we continue to discuss the problems of apartheid in Israel and the struggles against Israeli apartheid, we need to also dream beyond that. And I think that with all our problems, and we have huge problems in the South African context, one of the positive things is we didn't get it right, but nevertheless, one of the positive things is that before our liberation, long before our liberation, from the 70s, from the 80s, even before, some might argue, that the liberation movement in South Africa, which included the African National Congress, the Pan-Africanist Congress, the Black Consciousness Movement, trade unions, etc., not all of which, of course, agreed with each other at different points in time, but the liberation movement broadly in South Africa tried to imagine a new South Africa. And I think it's important in the Palestinian context that we do that too. What is it that we are imagining beyond statehood? I think many of us would agree that we're not talking about two states as an ideal, but a single Palestinian state. how do we resolve the national question? Who is a citizen of that state? Who is a Palestinian? A question, and all of these questions are questions I'm raising because they're questions that have not been addressed in our context, and so we understand why they're important to be addressed elsewhere. The national question, does white privilege, or how does white privilege in the South African context, how is it allowed to continue? And in the Palestinian context, in a new state, will Jewish privilege be allowed to continue in the same kind of way? How do we prevent that from happening? What happens to the ownership and control of the resources in that state? How do we see redress, restoration, and restitution to those who are marginalized, deprived, had their land stolen from them, etc., the Palestinian people, including, importantly, Palestinian refugees? I think all of these are questions that take us beyond the discussion about just about the nature of Israeli apartheid. Thank you, Ilan.